My younger sister, Vivi, recently graduated from high school. However, this hasn't been a straightforward journey for her by any means. In fact, she has failed high school twice before, and this was her third attempt. You see, Vivi has always struggled academically. From a young age, school was never her strong suit, and she found it extremely difficult to keep up with her peers. It wasn't just about bad grades, she also had a hard time staying focused and motivated, which really affected her performance. At first, she would make up excuses, saying she was dyslexic. However, after multiple tests, it was ruled out. After that, when she didn't have that as an excuse anymore, she started to act out and get into trouble. There were countless times when she was caught smoking weed with older students at her high school. She would often skip classes to go off to parties, which would then make the teachers call up my parents and complain to them. My parents were constantly at their wits' end. They tried talking to her, but that did not work. Then, they tried grounding her. However, Vivi would always find a way to sneak out, often in the middle of the night, to continue meeting up with her friends as usual, or even sometimes with random boyfriends she'd meet online. During this time, my parents, instead of holding Vivi accountable for her actions, would often turn their frustration toward me. They would blame me for not being a good older sister and say it was my job to guide her and show her how to be a better person. It wasn't like I didn't care about her, I did. I wanted to be a good sister. But the truth was, Vivi never really listened to me. Anytime I tried to talk her out of doing something reckless, she'd get upset and defensive. After a while, I stopped trying to intervene. I hated the constant fighting, and I hated feeling like it was somehow my responsibility to change her behavior when nothing I did seemed to help. So, I just let things go. It was easier to keep the peace that way, even though I knew deep down it wasn't helping Vivi make better decisions. One early morning, chaos broke out in our house. My mother, as was her routine, woke up and went to check on both me and Vivi, but when she entered Vivi's room, she found it empty. I was jolted awake by the sound of my mom screaming and yelling at me and my dad, demanding to know where Vivi was. Half asleep and confused, I rushed to Vivi's room, hoping maybe she had left a note or some sign of where she'd gone, but there was nothing. We tried calling her, but her phone was switched off, which only escalated the panic. At that point, we were ready to call the police. There was no trace of her, and we had no idea if she was safe or what might have happened. The whole situation was terrifying, and my parents were beside themselves with fear. Just as we were about to contact the authorities, one of our mutual friends reached out to me in private and confessed something shocking. Vivi had gone out again to meet a stranger, someone she had met online, for a date. I felt a wave of dread wash over me as I told my parents. That friend thankfully knew the guy's address, as Vivi had shared it with her. With this new information, we immediately drove to the guy's place. When we arrived, my mom didn't hesitate. She barged into the place, screaming Vivi's name. The look on Vivi's face when she saw us was a mixture of shock and embarrassment. She couldn't believe we had found her. Thankfully, nothing dangerous had happened between her and the guy. He seemed just as surprised as we were. He had no idea that Vivi was underage. Apparently, she had lied to him about her age, pretending to be older. My dad, furious, threatened the guy before practically dragging Vivi out of there. The car ride home was filled with shouting and accusations. Vivi was defiant as usual, arguing with our parents at every turn, while my mom tried to make her understand the gravity of what she had done. It was one of the most tense and exhausting car rides I can remember. Vivi was also furious at me for contacting our mutual friend and getting the guy's address from her. She kept telling me how she could have just snuck back home later and that all I had to do was keep my mouth shut. My sister clearly did not recognize how serious her actions were and how worried we all were for her safety. When we finally got home, my mom grounded Vivi, and I thought maybe Vivi would change for the better. But that's not what happened. Instead, after this close call, my parents became almost overly protective of their youngest child. They were so terrified by the thought of losing her that they started giving in to her demands just to keep her safe and sound at home. Vivi also realized just how much leverage she had. She knew that as long as they were afraid of her running off or getting into trouble, they would give in to what she wanted, and she exploited that advantage. Even when Vivi failed high school for the first time, I expected some sort of consequence, maybe a serious talk or some discipline to set her back on track. But instead, my parents didn't even scold her. Rather than addressing the issue head on, they told her they understood how difficult high school could be and encouraged her to try again, almost as if failing was no big deal. They believed they were supporting her by being understanding and patient, but to me, it felt like they were turning a blind eye to the reality of the situation. While they thought they were doing right by her, their leniency was only reinforcing her belief that she didn't have to take responsibility for her actions. Every time she messed up, they would excuse it. It was like they were rewarding her bad behavior instead of teaching her any kind of accountability. When she repeated high school for the second time, things didn't get any better. Vivi was caught cheating on one of her exams, and as a result, she was suspended from school. This was a serious offense, and I thought surely this would be at least the moment when my parents would finally step in and discipline her. But even then, they sympathized with her, as if the pressure of school was too much for her to handle and the cheating was just a result of that. However, this is when Vivi hit a low point and made the decision to drop out of high school entirely. She felt frustrated and defeated to see how her friends had a future while she was still stuck in high school. Hence, she started working at a bar to make some money and get by. Our parents tried to convince her multiple times and even urged me to talk to encouraging her to give school another shot. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I also knew she couldn't live her entire life working at a bar. My parents had clearly spoiled her enough and I needed to push her to be better. In the end, after a lot of back and forth, Vivi decided to go back and try one last time. My parents paid enough money to have Vivi enroll her into another high school despite her record so she could continue with her education. This time, I kept a close eye on her, and I have to say that she did work hard to pass her exams, unlike all the previous times. I was incredibly proud of her, and in order to celebrate her achievement, I took her out to celebrate. Later, when I dropped her off at my parents' place, I decided to stay the night in my old room as I was completely exhausted. I didn't have the energy to drive back to my place near college, so crashing in my room made sense. The next morning, I woke up to the deliciously familiar smell of cinnamon wafting through the house. My mom's cinnamon rolls were legendary in our family, so I knew right away that she must have made them for us. Feeling excited, I jumped out of bed and hurried down to the kitchen. As I got closer, I could hear my parents talking to each other in low voices. When I walked into the kitchen, they both looked up at me, their faces slightly tense. Sensing the awkwardness, I asked them what was going on. But instead of answering, they quickly brushed it off. My mom, trying to act casual, shook her head and said everything was fine. Then, she changed the subject, telling me that she really wanted me to stay for the whole day and join them for dinner later. I had been planning to go back to college that afternoon, but she insisted that one more day wouldn't hurt. I agreed, not thinking much about it. That very evening, during dinner, my dad told Vivi and me how proud they were of the both of us, and my mom nodded along. Then my parents turned to Vivi and asked her if she had started thinking about college yet. She immediately lit up and excitedly began talking about her plans. She told them how she had applied to several Ivy League schools, as she wanted to join a prestigious college like mine. She was hopeful and optimistic, waiting to hear back from the schools she had applied to. It was heartwarming to see her so excited about the future, especially after the difficulties she had faced in high school. My parents listened attentively, nodding as she spoke, but then they turned to me. There was a moment of silence, and the way they looked at me felt a little different, like there was something serious they wanted to discuss with me. As soon as my dad spoke, I could hear some nervousness in his voice. He started by mentioning that since Vivi would soon be heading off to college, he and my mom had discussed things between them and came to a very difficult decision. He said that they could no longer afford to pay for my college fees moving forward. I just sat there, looking stunned, not fully understanding what they were saying. My mom chimed in, trying to soften the blow, and explained how they had always wanted to remodel the house but couldn't do it earlier because they were so busy supporting me financially. Now, with Vivi about to start college, they would be dipping into their savings even further, which could lead to them not having enough retirement funds. She pointed out how it was only fair for me to start paying for my education on my own since I was an adult, and they couldn't fund both of our education. My mind was racing. How was I supposed to afford my own college fees? I barely had enough savings to get me through a couple of months, even though I had a part-time job. The thought of taking out loans to cover the rest of my education made my stomach drop. I had just 2 more years left until graduation, and now I was being told I'd be on my own financially. I glanced over at Vivi, and she looked just as shocked and concerned as I was. It didn't seem fair. She had just graduated after failing so many times, and while I was genuinely happy for her, the idea that I would now have to fend for myself while my parents continued to support her financially felt like a punch in the gut. I asked my parents if they planned to cover only 2 years of Vivi's college education as well like they had with me, and if she would also be expected to pay her way after that. They avoided eye contact, and the silence that followed was enough to give me my answer. My mother started saying that Vivi was the youngest and needed more attention, which was why they would be paying for her entire college education, otherwise she might drop off from college altogether. She and my dad couldn't see why I was so upset. To them, it made sense. Vivi needed their help, and I was old enough to take care of myself now. But to me, it felt like they were abandoning me halfway through something they had started. I tried to argue, to make them see how unfair this was. I wasn't asking them to completely fund my life, I just wanted them to follow through with the commitment they had made to me, just as they were going to do for Vivi. But they cut me off, my dad's tone growing more frustrated. He told me that if I couldn't afford the fees, then I could quit college and take a year off. He pointed out how taking a year off from college was not a big deal anyway, and that I could work double shifts to save up more money, and then return to finish my degree later. The idea of taking a year off from college, of delaying my graduation, felt like a nightmare. And while I understood that finances were tight, it hurt to see how easily they were willing to make that sacrifice for me but not for Vivi. Since that difficult dinner, I was at a complete loss about what to do next. Vivi was just as upset with our parents as I was, but I urged her not to argue with them further. I told her that if she pushed too hard, they might cut off her college funding as well, leaving her in the same position I was in, having to figure out how to pay for everything on her own. The last thing I wanted was for both of us to be stuck in this situation. A few days ago, Vivi, surprisingly, was the one who gave me the idea to reach out to our maternal grandparents for help. They're quite well off, and growing up, both Vivi and I had spent a lot of time with them. They lived in a different town, and though it had been a while since I visited, I decided to take the bus to see them in person. It felt like they were my last hope. When I arrived, my grandparents were pleasantly surprised to see me. They were thrilled that I had come down to visit, and their warm welcome made me feel a little more at ease, though the knot in my stomach didn't fully disappear. They had no idea why I was really there, and I felt guilty for not being able to just enjoy the visit without bringing up my financial troubles. After settling in, I finally mustered the courage to open up to them. I told them everything about the conversation with my parents, how they had decided to stop paying for my college, and how I now had no way of covering the costs. I tried to keep it together, but it was hard not to feel emotional. I could see the concern on their faces as I spoke, but they listened patiently without interrupting. Then, with my heart racing, I asked them if they could loan me some money to help cover my college expenses. I made sure to emphasize that it would be a loan, and I promised I would pay it all back as soon as I could. I was serious about it. I didn't want them to feel like I was just asking for a handout. I wanted them to know I was committed to repaying every penny. Still, asking for help from them felt like I was crossing a line, and I couldn't shake the guilt, even as I sat there hoping they would say yes. However, my grandparents seemed taken aback by my request. They exchanged confused glances, and then my grandfather asked why I would need more money when I already had a college fund. I stared back at them, just as confused, and asked, "What college fund?" This is when my grandfather explained something that completely floored me. He told me that both he and my grandmother had set up two separate college funds years ago, one for me and one for Vivi. After I turned 18, they gave both the funds to my parents, trusting them to manage it and use it solely for our education. This is apparently how my parents had been paying for my college fees until now. My grandparents were under the impression that me and Vivi were taken care of and said I simply needed to ask my parents for the money that had been set aside for me. I was speechless. I looked at my grandparents incredulously, trying to process what they were telling me. My parents had never once mentioned anything about a college fund, not to me, not to Vivi. For years, we had been under the impression that our parents were paying for our education out of their own savings. My mind was racing with questions. Why hadn't my parents told us about this? Where had the money gone? What were they using it for if not for our college expenses? I felt really angry and betrayed. All this time, they had let me believe I would have to take out loans or drop out of school, while they had this fund that could easily cover everything. It didn't make any sense. Right there at my grandparents' house, I called my mother and put her on speakerphone so my grandparents could hear everything. I didn't want there to be any misunderstandings, and I wanted to get to the bottom of this once and for all. When she answered, I asked her directly about the college fund that my grandparents had supposedly given her for me. There was a pause on the other end, and I could tell right away that she was caught off guard. Her hesitation only fueled my suspicion. She was scrambling to figure out how to handle the situation and asked me who had put such wrong ideas in my head. That's when I told her that it was my grandparents who had given me the information after I had come down to meet them to ask for money. At this point, I could hear her tense up. She got furious that I had gone to meet them without talking to her first and tried to explain, saying that the money her parents gave wasn't exactly a college fund specifically for me but rather money intended for the entire family. But before she could continue, my grandfather, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. He firmly pointed out that when he had given them the money, he had been very clear it was specifically for mine and Vivi's college education, not some general family fund. He asked her sternly where she was planning on using the money if not on my college expenses for the remaining 2 years. My mother fell silent after hearing him say that, as if she didn't know how to respond. She then said that she would need to talk to my dad and ask him more about it, as he was the one who handled their finances. The way she seemed so flustered and evasive, only made me more suspicious. It was as though she had been caught in a lie, or at the very least, in something they had been trying to keep hidden from me. Later, she texted me, insisting that I had no right to meet up with my grandparents behind her back. She accused me of being a jerk for allowing her parents to overhear our conversation without her knowledge. Ida for trying to find out what happened to my college fund which my grandparents had saved up for me. Update 1. As many of you suggested, my grandparents and I did make the decision to confront my parents directly to uncover the truth. When we arrived at my parents' place, my grandfather didn't waste much time. He immediately launched into the reason we were there, demanding answers about the college fund. Without mincing words, he asked why they were suddenly refusing to pay for my college expenses when, in reality, the money set aside for my education had been a gift from him and my grandmother. My father attempted to explain something about how the money just wasn't enough for my expenses. But my grandfather had come prepared with proof. Without hesitation, he pulled out a stack of financial statements showing exactly how much money he had saved up over the years for my college education and given to my parents. Let me tell you, it was a lot and more than enough for the entire 4 years of my college expenses and then some. I couldn't hold back my frustration any longer. I confronted my parents directly, asking them why they had never once mentioned the existence of this college fund to me. I pointed out how stressed out I had been for the past couple of days trying to figure things out. How could they knowingly allow me to struggle like that without ever telling me the truth? That's when my mom finally broke down and confessed. She admitted, with clear guilt in her voice, that over the years, they had slowly started dipping into my college fund. First, they had used up a significant portion toward taking care of Vivi. It turned out that all those times Vivi had failed her high school, and my parents had stepped in to pay for her private high school fees again and again or hire expensive tutors to help her out, they had been using my college fund to do it. I had always assumed they were dipping into their own savings or making sacrifices. But in reality, it was my future they were draining to prop her up. My mom also confessed that they had used the money sometimes to even fund several vacations she and dad had taken over the years. My parents admitted that Vivi's new phone, her new car, yes, the one she was currently driving around, had all been bought with my college fund. As a result of all this, along with the fees that they had paid for me already these past 2 years in college, my college fund, which my grandparents had so carefully saved over the years, was now completely exhausted. However, Vivi's college fund still remained completely untouched. I pointed out how it only seemed fair then if they paid my remaining semesters in college using her fund since they had used my money on her as well over the years. At this point, my dad chimed in, trying to dissuade me. He told me how I was his more mature kid, the unproblematic child who always managed to figure things out on her own. He urged me not to touch Vivi's college fund to pay for my college expenses, saying that if I did, her college funds would get exhausted too and then she might have to struggle. He told me how Vivi had always needed more help than I did and that as her big sister I should not be asking for her money. It was as if he expected me to understand and even agree with their reasoning. The implication was clear. My parents clearly believed that my sacrifices were somehow justified because, in their eyes, I was strong enough to handle the consequences of their actions, while Vivi, who had always been more dependent on them, couldn't. Hearing their words was like a punch to the gut. My grandparents were absolutely furious as the full extent of my parents' actions came to light. My grandmother outright stated that she would fully support me if I wanted to sue my parents for wrongfully misusing the college fund that had been intended for my future. There was no sympathy in her voice as she pointed out that what my parents had done wasn't just morally wrong, but it was legally questionable too. My parents, clearly panicking now, tried to argue and justify their behavior. They fumbled for excuses, saying they had done what they thought was best for the family, but by now, their words held no weight. My grandfather had heard enough and cut them off. He reminded my parents, in no uncertain terms, that years ago, he had generously gifted them the family house which they now lived in. He had done this so that my mom and dad could focus on raising a family without the burden of ever worrying about buying a home. It was a gesture of love and support. He had never once asked them to pay rent or threatened to take the house away. But now, seeing how selfishly they had taken the money meant for my college education, using it not only on themselves but also on their other child, on Vivi's high school fees, tutor expenses, her car, and her phones, it was too much to bear and he could no longer trust them. My grandfather declared that they needed to be taught a lesson. He told them that he would meet with a lawyer and transfer the deed of the house from his name to mine. In doing so, I would become the rightful owner of the house. My grandfather added, without hesitation, that if I wanted to, I could then just kick them out of the house entirely. Alternatively, if they wished to continue living there, they would have to start paying me rent. And with that rent, I could cover the college expenses they had forced me to shoulder on my own. My parents were speechless. I could barely contain the satisfaction that was bubbling up inside me. For the first time in this entire ordeal, my parents, who had secretly spent years making selfish decisions and prioritizing themselves and Vivi at my expense, were finally going to get a taste of their own medicine. Ever since then, my parents have been pleading with my grandfather to forgive them, and my dad has even offered to use his own savings and sell Vivi's car if necessary to cover my college expenses. However, my grandfather remains firm in his decision. Update 2, sorry, for no updates for the last 2 weeks. For everyone wondering where my sister was during the intense confrontation between my grandparents and parents, I did not mention this in my previous update, but my darling sister was off celebrating with her friends at a lake house. Apparently, she was footing the bill for this getaway, which was a gift from my parents for having finally managed to pass high school. When I confronted my parents about it, their response was almost laughable. They told me how Vivi needed to relax after all the stress of high school. Can you imagine the audacity? Here I was, practically begging and fighting tooth and nail just to get them to cover my college expenses, the ones that should have already been covered by my college fund, while they had no issue at all paying for the youngest to go on a luxurious celebration. The double standards are infuriating, to say the least. Update 3, I come here bearing happy news. True to his word, my grandfather followed through, and the house deed has officially been transferred to me. I am now the rightful owner of our family home. The sense of empowerment I feel is unlike anything I've experienced before. For so long, I have felt powerless in the face of my parents' decisions, but now, the control is firmly in my own hands. Naturally, my parents are furious with me. They had expected to remain in the house without consequence, but those days were over. Despite their anger, I stood my ground and made it clear that they had 2 options. Either they could vacate the house within a month, or they could stay but prepare to pay me rent starting next month. There was no room for negotiation. It's almost ironic, after everything they've put me through, now they are the ones facing a tough choice. Of course, my sister Vivi has found out about everything by now. Since a lot of you keep asking me in the comments, I want to be clear that she wasn't ever involved in what our parents did or even had any idea about our college funds. Despite the fact that so much of the money had been spent on her education and luxuries, she wasn't the one making the decisions. In fact, she's been incredibly supportive of me throughout this ordeal. When she learned about the full extent of our parents' actions, she was just as furious as I was. She's angry at them for how they mishandled the college fund and betrayed not just me, but the trust our grandparents had placed in them. It's comforting to know that she's on my side. In the end, I am just so grateful to my grandparents for everything. I don't know what I would have done without them here. I owe them so much, more than words can express.